Greetings, chaplains. Today's topic will be from self-violence to self-care, a matter of being human. This chaplain worked 50, 60 hours a week, on call 6 days per week, only one night off, and he was the only chaplain for the entire hospital. On top of that, it has to preach on Saturdays. It was expected to offer Bible studies, to take care of other situations, give seminaries, attend family. It has to be no more than 50 miles away from the hospital in case it's been called. And many times, even in grocery stores, doing groceries, he had to leave it on the line and run and rush to the hospital. It was overwhelming. After some years, he was depressed, suffering anxiety in a burnout. Does this sound familiar to any of you? Have any of you suffered or had experienced what is a burnout? To be depressed, to be anxious of everything. Maybe it is just the story I'm telling you, not because I heard it, because that chaplain was me a few years ago. And I suffer a terrible burnout. Research says that it's not uncommon for chaplains and pastors go through this. I want to share with you in this section few of the research, the most current that I could find, that support what I want to share with you today. One of those is, it was performed in 2016, and it's an update research on happenings in pastors' personal and church lives. They randomly call and contact 8,150 pastors, and they found some of their findings I'm going to share with you are 50% of them were overworked, 43% overstressed, 35% of them suffer or battle depression or fear or of inadequacy. 26 were overly fatigued. 28% are spiritual undernourished. 9% experience burnout. And 41.27% seriously consider leaving ministry. This is a reality for pastors and ministers, chaplains. We are in a high-risk profession for mental health conditions due to the challenges that we day-to-day face. Another study, this was a longitudinal study, means that it went over years collecting data. And in this one, clergy show up more likely to suffer depression and anxiety than the general population. The national rate was 5.5, and clergy were experiencing 11.1%. And the anxiety levels were on 13.5%. This study says that the pastor's emotional health was kind of dependent on the state of their ministry, and therefore put some more pressure over them. Lastly, a survey conducted to 1,000 other pastors and ministers in the United States found out that 23% of pastors indicated that they personally struggle with mental illness of some kind. Though we have a little bit more research on the area of burnout, depression, anxiety for ministers and chaplains, we don't have really good numbers on one other issue that is attacking us and that touch our reality, and that is suicide. Suicide, pastors falling into their own swords, it's another reality. We may not have research that is tracking those numbers with detail, but we do have the reason why and the scenario that can push a pastor to commit suicide. We don't have those numbers, but I'm sure that you and I know stories of a friend, a colleague, another chaplain or pastor that committed suicide. Why is it that we are in a high risk? Why is it that clergy is in a position of such much pressure that can impact the mental health, the stability of us? Well, in a study that was measuring clergy burnout, and it compares those with another helping professions, it says that the source of clergy burnout are several, according to their findings. One was role overload, meaning we have to play many different roles in our ministry. We are preachers, we are teachers, we are administrators, counselors, so many different roles. And as we move from one to another, it increases our stress levels. Another list of findings is that clergy were found to report higher levels of this set of symptoms or factors. Number one, role ambiguity. Because many people does not know how to treat us or how to address us, or based on that role overload, different types of role, we suffer that pressure on role ambiguity and role conflict. Boundary violations. It was found that it was harder for us to have clear boundaries with the people we served and the people that surround us. And when we don't have clear boundaries, that overwhelms us. Emotional triangulation and isolation. This is not new. We know this stuff. Many times, especially in the military, have you ever experienced that you are out there in a post in the middle of nowhere? How about deployments? And isolation is a factor that is critical in our professions. Exposure to crisis, parishioners or the people that are constantly needing from us. Inadequate opportunities to process emotions, because we may go through a crisis, we may see somebody suffering, but we kind of have to keep it all together and force ourselves to keep it all together in order to assist and help them. And then we should be going back and keep in touch with our emotions, but we don't find that time. We go back to our battle rhythms, to the rhythm of work and more other responsibilities. So we end up with inadequate opportunities to process our emotions. Criticism. That never happens to us, right? We are never criticized. We're always doing right. I forgot to tell you that when I was that hospital chaplain, in top of all that I mentioned to you, to say some of my own circumstances, I was being told by my administration that I was not doing a good job. And I was strongly criticized, and I had to also deal with gossiping and many other things. And I don't want even to mention the difference between being a woman in this scenario and all the pressure that brings. So this last study says that clergy and their parishioners also suffer burnout because of a unique condition that happens only in this profession. They attribute it to the fact that we believe on the sacredness of the ministry work, which may drive pastors, chaplains, ministers to work harder and longer than other helping professionals in order to avoid perceived failure. And that only pushes us more into the burnout, depression, anxiety, and many other things. Last factor that I want to share with you on that research shows that I found so interesting, and I had never heard them before, is the physiological over-arousal that we suffer, caused by being in constant stress. You see, what happened is that because we have to provide for so many roles, so many people demanding from us, so many different things, isolation, depression, and all this, our system, our bodies automatically have to push in order for us to work and function. It has to push a big shot of adrenaline constantly, lots of adrenaline, so we can keep up with everything we have to do. And at the end, what that causes is an over-arousal. We get an adrenaline exhaustion, and our bodies feel it when we stop. And the interesting portion of this factor is that the research says that even positive and exciting dimensions of ministry, such as preaching and comforting parishioners or the soldiers in our case, or servicemen and women, even those that we enjoy, likely to contribute to adrenaline exhaustion because we have to be aroused, we have to be up to do all these things. So this factor, specifically the adrenaline exhaustion, was found to be a uniquely factor among clergy, not among the other professionals, helping professionals. They compare pastors. Those are social workers, first responders, police officers. But this was a unique factor among clergy, and the adrenaline exhaustion was correlated with what is called in the literature depersonalization. So we have this unique factor within our ranks, and it pushes and is correlating to depersonalization, which is the action of depriving someone of human characteristics, of taking their own individuality for that person. That's what depersonalization does, and it was linked to the adrenaline exhaustion clergy experience. Isn't that amazing? Incredible? When I read this, I recall reading from Philip Zimbardo. He is a social psychologist, and he was called as an expert witness for the defense side in the process, in the legal process of one of the military police prison guards of Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. This psychologist was called from the defense side because his theory was, after many years of studying, that sometimes people that are just common and normal as you and I, during some circumstances and under certain factors, their behavior can change in order to commit horrific things. Also, Philip Zimbardo dealt with victims of the Rwanda genocide. So that's his specialty. And this is one of his findings on how to explain how people can get to do these horrific things. Not responding to the human qualities of the persons automatically facilitates inhumane actions. Seeing a person as not human ends up making you doing the most horrific things you could ever imagine. So, dehumanizing someone makes you do the most horrific things you can ever even think of. Actually, this is the foundation for racism. When you see someone less than human, you can treat them as an object, and you think you can do anything on that person, and you don't feel guilty about it. Removing human qualities in any person encourages inhumane and violent acts against them. So going back to the last research I shared with you, excess of adrenaline it's correlated to depersonalization, which is in fact how we get to remove human qualities of people. This is such a high risk factor for us. And as I was reading some years ago from Kirk Byron Jones in his book Self-Care Strategies for Clergy, he says that self-violence, self-neglect is a form of violence. Self-neglect is a form of violence. And the sad part is that it's socially acceptable in the military is actually being rewarded. You get more awards, you get better positions, and you get more recognition when you overwork yourself, when you self-neglect yourself. And it's easy to camouflage, especially for chaplains, ministers, and pastors, because we can put it under the title of selfless service. Self-neglect is socially acceptable form of brutality. What happens then? Not if I dehumanize or depersonalize another person. What will happen if I do that to me? What happens when I dehumanize myself? And I think that has a lot to do with the title of this presentation, Self-Care, Self-Violence, and Self-Care, a matter of being human. Without knowing that we are equally human with others, we don't get a chance to fight the high risk factors that we are vulnerable to. I want to address you to the Bible. What I call in Matthew 22, what I call the third great commandment. As we read there, Jesus is telling the Pharisees, based on one of their questions, what are the great commandments to keep? And he says, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. We know this perfectly. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You should love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. What I call the third commandment, and I'm not doing an exegesis on this, but what I call the third commandment is that last phrase. Love your neighbor. How? There's a standard implied here, clearly specified by Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. We cannot love our neighbor above us. That's not what the commandment says. We can neither look down to our neighbor. We have to love them as ourselves. And actually, it says love. So self-love is not anti-biblical. It's not non-Christian. It's not a sinful quality. Because that's the challenge. We think it's selfish. Love yourself. It's a principle established by Jesus himself in this great commandment. So I think it is important for us to stop and consider a little bit. How much self-love are we practicing? As we relate and service people and help people, are we always putting them above us or below us? What is the metric? What is the standard that we use to balance the love for your neighbor and the love for myself? These are critical and important questions because self-care will depend on this pretty much. As yourself. How you see yourself is the next logical question. Because depending on how you see yourself is how you're going to love your neighbor. You cannot love your neighbor without knowing how you love yourself. So how you see yourself, the person you are, is it less or is it more than human? And why I make this question? Because it is normal for us in the ministry and in chaplaincy to feel that we have to be there all the time for everyone. It's normal for us to feel that we are indispensable, especially in the military. Sometimes we have a chaplain for 800, 1,000, 1,200 soldiers, servicemen and women. an entire ship? I don't know. But we are pretty much demanded because we're few. We're just few. But how you see yourself? Are we indispensables? Do we have suffered the messianic complex, which in the literature says that is when I feel that I'm here to save everyone, and it's my responsibility to save every person I get in contact with? And how much pressure does that put on me? Does that make me more human or less human? Do I think I'm invincible? As I read in some place, do I consider myself like a God Junior? Which I serve the Almighty, but I'm not the Almighty. I work for the Almighty, but I'm not. How much I balance this with the reality that I'm a human being? How I see myself? Is my self-worth tied to performance? If I don't do the right things, if I don't do the right amount, if the church doesn't recognize me, if the local church doesn't validate my ministry, I'm not worthy. What is the measurement of humanity that I have for myself? And do I discard, do I throw away my person, my individuality, who I am, along with selfishness and egoism? Sometimes I feel that in order to be a good servant, selfless servant, I cannot be selfish. Therefore, I have to throw away everything that surrounds myself. But then it's like throwing the baby with the used water, right? Because we're losing who we are, trying to get rid of the selfishness. How I see myself. Less than human, or actually more than human, thinking that I can manage everything that is thrown my way and that will not cause any consequence on myself. Those are the realities in ministry. So the challenge, as I mentioned before, is that self-love sounds so selfish that it's a natural reaction to reject it in our profession, in our church even. And it is the same as talking about suicide. We don't want to talk about it. We know it does exist. We know it had happened and continues happening in our churches, in our ranks as chaplains, as ministers, but we don't want to talk about it. And few wants to talk about self-love because they don't want to sound selfish and egocentric. So that's the challenge when we're talking about self-care. How we can distinguish, is there any way I can separate that confusion? Jones continues saying that we need to move away from this camouflage, where we camouflage unhealthy living habits in the rhetoric of unselfish, sacrificial living. No, I have to sacrifice myself in order to be really a selfless servant. John says, it is easy to trivialize the hurt of personal pain when you have been trained to focus on the pain of others. We work so much to serve others that sometimes we forget our own pain, our own loneliness and struggles, our humanity. Self-care, he says, might be perceived as weakness. And depending on the culture as well, there will be some other factors that will come into consideration. And in specific cultures, it will be more higher levels of seeing self-care as weakness. But I love what he says. Personal well-being is not a less sacred calling than ministry. We are responsible before God for our own lives to follow the great commandment of loving neighbors as ourselves. Before God called us to do ministry, He called us to be human, being His children, being that unique combination of a human sinner, but being adopted as a child of God. That's who we are. And we need to grasp this. For us, we are not in this ministry to treat us less, nor to treat us more and boast in what we are. You are you, not your ministry. There's also selfish self-care. And that's a whole different topic that I don't have time to cover. But yes, we do consider that sometimes people are centered only on their benefit. And that's not what I'm talking. I'm talking about the power and the encouragement we receive when we recognize our humanity, we work out with it to serve better, to love better others, and to love better ourselves, as Jesus asked. So I'm going to come back to other set of research studies, because not everything is negative, right? There are research that found out what are the protective factors, things that can help us deal with the high risk factors that we suffer as a profession. There's one study that found unique positive mental health factors for clergy. And one of those, interesting enough, says that for those that have congregation, having a congregation that is positively engaged in the larger community and open to new ideas and people can support and help the pastor. And then it says also, the other finding, that experiencing support from congregants as an individual and not just as a pastor. A congregational support of the pastor as a person can help save the mental health, the stability, even the life of their chaplains, of their pastors. So how important it is, again, that even the people we serve can see us as a human being, as a person. And in that way protects us from burning out, because we feel understood and with the freedom to be honest of everything we do, to create the boundaries, and to move forward and to love ourselves better. So another study that I found incredibly interesting. This one study factors predicting burnout among chaplains. Chaplains of all scenarios, hospital, hospice, military, different types of chaplain. Though it was more, it looked more into hospital chaplains because they were the ones that responded the most on the survey or the research. But the factors, I believe, are consistent across the board. This study, the purpose of this study was to examine the relationship between self-care practices and the professional quality of life of chaplains. So it hits specifically on the topic we're sharing today. These are some of the findings. Self-care practices' effect on burnout were significant. So what that says in a study is that the chaplains that have a specific set of self-care practices were less probably to suffer from burnout. Also says, chaplains who engage in multiple and frequent self-care strategies experience higher professional quality of life and low burnout risk. So it was not only to fight or to low burnout risk. The correlation is that it will also improve the professional quality of life. Chaplains experiencing compassion satisfaction and practicing these frequent self-care strategies had lower burnout risk. Compassion satisfaction. And there's a link I'm going to mention in a few moments about compassion. When chaplains feel a sense of joy and purpose and have their needs met. And their needs here are specifically talking about Maslow hierarchy. Those are hierarchies of needs from basic to more elaborate. When those needs are met and we have a sense of joy and purpose, they can buffer the impact of compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, and burnout. Lastly, burnout risk is reduced by the feeling that a chaplain's work is a calling that they enjoy. So from the beginning, this study, what it's saying is, we need to have self-care practices, no concepts, not a plan, practices integrated to our life. We need to have a sense of joy and purpose, and we need to experience a calling, the joy for the calling in this ministry. That's why it's a calling. It's not a profession you just pick up. It's something you have to be called upon that. In this study, it established in order of strength the factors that most help chaplains to prevent burnout and other conditions. So I want to mention them to you so you can have an idea. And I'm going to start from the basic one, the last one that strengthens the burnout, all the way up to the most important factor against burnout. So the first one was physical care. Though it's really important to eat well, doing exercise and sleep and rest, physical care was the least strong factor related to low the burnout risk. Isn't that interesting? So chaplains, pastors, ministers, it's good to have a good diet. It's important to do exercise. But if you only do that, you're not even at 20% of the protective factors that you need to fight back the risk of burnout and self-violence. So please, let's move on from that point to other factors that are more critical in our life. So this study finds that after physical care, mindful relaxation was the other less strong factor. Then supportive structure, family members, friends are really good, important, but is not even 40%, not even halfway to the point where we can prevent burnout. After supportive structure, then we have supportive relationships, close relationships that hold us there and support us as we deal with all the challenges of this profession. But the two top factors that correlate higher percentages in preventing or lowering burnout were mindful awareness and self-compassion. How about that? Self-compassion was the number one factor preventing or lowering the risk for burnout, for traumatic stress, and other conditions in chaplains. Self-compassion and purpose and mindful self-awareness were the stronger and strongest mediators between compassion, satisfaction, and burnout. It is interesting, this study also have a point there, includes a consideration stating that when they study specifically professionals in the healthcare system, they found out that besides the self-care practices, which are those that I mentioned to you, they need their organization to foster a culture that promotes and do not distract from a professional well-being. So what that means is, it's not only our responsibility as individuals, But there's a collective responsibility to promote and create a culture of self-care, of self-love that protects the servant, the chaplain, the pastor, and the minister. Finally, as part of those protective factors that this study find out and compare, you're going to like this one. There are a couple more that I want to share with you. But it says, uniquely buffering factors of the clergy role identified above, such as ministry satisfaction, and guess what? Sabbath keeping and mentoring relationships had been proved to protect us from burnout, from self-destruction, from all this risk that our profession bring. They're discovering now, you and I have discovered for many years now. Now my question is just a reflection. Are we just keeping the right date, or are we keeping and practicing the Sabbath, the rest of the Sabbath? Or are we just as busy as any other day? These factors are critical to protect us and to give us a chance when we have to fight the risk in our professions. And I want to close this part with a quote from Ellen G. White. It's a letter number 1, written by her in 1878. The context of this letter is that James, her husband, had been already sick, and he's pushing himself to keep writing and printing for the church. And actually, I believe at that point he was the president of the General Conference. So in 1878, James, which was only 58 years old, was attempting to keep up his health. And Sister White had a vision in which pushed him to look for help. And he ended up being treated by Dr. Kellogg, on that summer. On June 24, James wrote to Helen, "I report myself very much improved." That was June. In early July, James left for their Colorado cabin, a place they have that they can rest and recover. But Helen had to go to the east because she had some previous appointments. So she wrote this letter to him and the children with instructions of what to do at this time, during their time in the Colorado cabin. And this is what it says. "Do not regard this time of recreation as a drudgery or a boring work or a task. Lay aside your work. Let the writings go. Go over into the park and see all that you can. Throw off every burden and be a carefree boy again." Father needs to be a boy again, she writes to her children. Roam all around. Climb the mountain steeps. Ride horseback. Find something new each day to see and enjoy. This will be for Father's health. And she continues writing in this letter. Camp out, fish, hunt, go to places that you have not seen. Rest as you go and enjoy everything. Then come back to your work fresh and vigorous. Do not think that so much writing is necessary. This will keep. Lay all such work aside. I know you will all please God much better by seeking to build up your strength. Further on, she says, in the ministry of healing, that some make themselves sick by overwork, and for this, rest and freedom of care are essential to restoration of their health. This is not something new. Moving from self-violence to self-care is not new. There are biblical principles. They had always existed to protect us. It doesn't mean our profession does not have risk. It does have. We need to recognize that. We are at risk. But there are so many other factors. And we are encouraged, as Ellen encouraged James, to put aside work, rest, relax, chill out. Be a boy again, she says. I love that part. Enjoy life without the pressures of the job, the responsibilities. We are called to do the same. I want to close out this last section with emphasizing the 3 protective factors that we need to start practicing right now. If we're not doing it, we need to start right now. Number 1 is we need to help to build a culture of care, of self-care. Teach the people you serve by putting boundaries, by saying, no, I cannot do that right now, by protecting your day off. Teach your supervisors as well. Not everything that your boss asks you to do, it's possible to do it in a specific time. Sometimes you have to also just offer an 80% solution and move away from perfectionism and always be 100% available. Especially, we need to support other chaplains and pastors by presenting a united front about self-care. And what I mean with this is, if you keep working 70 hours per week, nonstop, if you keep postponing your vacation time, if you don't take any day off, you know what's going to happen to me when I ask for a day off? My boss will compare me to you. And you will be sinking me in the process. We need to all start doing the same thing. We all need to start doing self-care. In that way, we're also protecting the ones that come behind us. Because it teaches, that's the only way. It teaches the system, the church, the supervisors, and the people we serve. We have to do this in order to take care of our brothers and sisters in this fight. The other 2 factors, I just mentioned it before in the last study. Number 1, self-awareness, and then self-compassion. The top 2. I'm going to begin by self-awareness. Just stop a minute there. What is self-awareness? What does they mean as a protective factor, self-awareness? Well, self-awareness is the capacity to recognize, accept, celebrate, and care for our humanity. Awareness of our humanity. It's all it takes to start and protect ourselves from risk factors, from the stress, from the anxiety, from the depression, from the pain that cause and push people to suicide. It's to understand, to be aware that I'm not more than a human. I'm not a semi-God. I cannot do all the things that I'm being asked to do. I have limitations. It's my awareness of humanity that I'm not even, that neither I'm less. I'm not less because I'm saying no or because I have boundaries. What the Great Commandment teaches us is that there's an equality of humanity, a common humanity between my neighbor and myself. We are both human beings that need to love and be loved. We are all both humans that need God's grace and salvation every day. And as I accept this reality, it protects me from falling into any other of the burnout and other conditions that I may suffer. Self-awareness also includes expressing emotions and feelings. One time somebody told me, "You're a chaplain, you cannot cry when you're dealing with someone that's crying." And I said, "I don't know what school you went, But my background as a chaplain, it trained me the opposite. If I need to cry, I will cry with them. But we cry with hope, right? We just not only suffer, we suffer with hope that God will provide the strength. But we have to express our emotions and feelings. And again, there are some factors that might influence this, positive or negative. We have to talk with other people. We have to find some friends in and outside our denomination, people of different ages, different perspectives that can balance our self-awareness. And we can do many other practices that are found out there in the literature. Just saying a couple that can help us, give us a start. And also, it's part of self-awareness to know the theology and the cultural aspects that influence my ministry and myself. Theology and culture plays a really critical factor on my self-awareness. Do I identify who I am based on what the culture says, based on what society says, based on what any study says? I need to be clear, what is influencing the way I see myself? Is it helping me to accept, value, celebrate, and care my humanity? Or is it making me believe that I'm more capable than any other human? Or is it pushing me to feel rejected and less? And finally, self-compassion. And I left that for last because it was the most important factor in this study. And I believe it is the cornerstone for self-care and to push us and move us from the self-violence we practice by not taking care of us to a more self-care focus. So self-compassion. In this topic, I have read and hear one of the modern experts on self-compassion. That is Dr. Christine Neff. She's a pioneer in the field of self-compassion. And she says self-compassion is no different than having compassion for others. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? But she says, in order to have compassion for others, what are the things you do? She says, first, to have compassion for others, you must notice that they are suffering. Basic stuff, seems like, right? If I want to have compassion with others, I have to notice that they're suffering. Second, compassion involves feeling moved by others' suffering so that your heart respond to their pain. So again, it's not only to notice that that person is suffering. Remember what Zimbardo says. When you dehumanize, when you detach from that humanity of the person, you cannot see their suffering. The opposite of that is that compassion can see the suffering, but it's not only noticing, it's to be moved, to respond to that pain. And she says, the word compassion literally means suffer with. When this occurs, when your heart is moved by compassion to respond to the pain of others, you feel the warmth, the caring, and the desire to help that person, and you go ahead and you do it. Having compassion, she says, also meant that you offer understanding and kindness to others when they fail or made mistakes, rather than being judgmental and harsh. Finally, she says, compassion to others, when you feel that compassion for another person, which is not the same as pity, that compassion means that you realize that suffering, failure, and imperfection is part of the shared human experience. So when you're moved by compassion, You notice your neighbor suffering. Your heart is moved to respond to that pain. And you actually start taking care of that person, sitting in their pain while they're suffering without judgment, without any standard, any requirements. Now the question is, self-compassion. Now she stated that self-compassion is not different than having compassion for others. When was the last time that you practiced this for your own self? When was the last time that you noticed your suffering, your pain? What is it that pains you? What is it that caused you to struggle? Your weaknesses. When was the last time you took a look at yourself? And then when was the last time that your heart responded to your own pain and suffering? When was the last time you sit with your own self and your own pain and your struggles and your weaknesses? And most importantly, when was the last time that you were moved to care for yourself in a non-judgmental or harsh way? Self-compassion was number one factor protecting against burnout, anxiety, depressions, any other conditions that impact our lives. Self-compassion, she closed. It's involving the act the same way towards yourself when you're having a difficult time, a fail, or notice something you don't like about yourself. Instead of just ignoring your pain, you stop to tell yourself, this is really difficult right now. How can I comfort and care for myself in this moment? From self-violence, from a culture that pushes us to give more and perform and fulfill many roles and push us to isolation, to a mentality of self-care, following the great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. Let us just enjoy, be human.